Hello and welcome to the new episode of Access Up Space Defense and Security Podcast. So today we have a returning guest with us, Mr. Adam Rousselle. Hi Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Omkar. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's great to have you, Adam, back on the podcast. I remember, I mean, we just spoke that uh, you were one of the first guests at the when our podcast was at initial level. So thank you for trusting us at that time, because of which experts like you who came on our podcast, because of which we were able to grow as a company and as well as a podcast. So thank you again for that. And yeah, I think it's great times that we are living in, I would say, in a more from a geopolitical perspective. So yeah, I think to begin with the episode, that is from terror funding to statecraft, weaponized finance in the age of AI. Before we actually deep dive, our audience has, diversity has increased and the number of people listening to our show has also increased. So it would be great if you can briefly introduce yourself, basically what you're doing at the moment, what your current expertise, and how you ended up doing what you're doing at the moment.
Sure. So, my name is Adam Rousselle. I'm the founder and chief analyst at Between the Lines Research. Uh, Primary focus there is on illicit finance and the downstream threats of it. So, my thesis is a pretty simple one. Unregulated capital flows, most significantly from China, but also Russia, Iran, and others, are not just peripheral criminal phenomena. They function as strategic liquidity layers that enable narco terrorism, industrial scale scam economies, transnational militant networks, and other downstream threats. The reality is that we are now seeing money capable of moving faster than ever before. And it has become a sort of force of sovereignty in that capital is so mobile now that it can create parallel and alternate sovereignties and nodes thereof all over the world. And these systems, these parallel systems, have been enabled by states that are seeking to operate outside formal regulation, but they now can't control them. And so they're a vector of threat for both the countries that have started and enabled them and for the countries downstream of them, whether that be a country like Cambodia that struggles to contain the scope of its scam economy, or victims across Europe and the United States who are victims of those scams, or victims back in China. Um, these parallel systems have mutated and taken on a life of their own, and we are now beginning to deal with the scope of this threat.
That's quite interesting, actually, your journey and the kind of expertise you have. So taking a deep dive directly into the topic, which is very interesting. I mean, I come from a defense, security, and intelligence background. For me, I think, of course, this is a kind of an additional layer which always remains hidden, not so much spoken about, and that is one of the reasons that we have you as an expert on this show. So, to begin with, why should illicit finance be treated as a national and global security threat from your perspective, rather than just a financial crime or compliance issue?
Well, I've been rolling this out in my research. Like I said, these parallel systems, once created, are beyond the scope of any one state's control. And so they become threat vectors in and of themselves because the people running them are
Yes.
opportunistic. So while they can be used to generate cash and move cash off the grid for criminal actors, some criminal actors are also armed militant groups, right? So if we look at like the Sinaloa cartel or the Jalisco Nuevo Generacion CJNG cartels in Mexico, um, we have a pure linkage of enablement trans-Pacific, where capital
Yeah.
wants to escape China's strict system. financial governance there dictates that
Yes.
you can only transfer out $50,000 a year as an individual. And so parallel systems have emerged where, I mean, I don't want to go into the entire, we can look at the article, but uh, what's called a mirror transfer, where the value stays technically in China, but the product, like electronics and other consumer goods and fentanyl, moves out, while the cash is laundered stateside. And so what you have is this entire parallel economy that is fueling violence on both sides of the US Mexican border, right? Militant groups, namely these cartels, which have I mean, there's tons of research on this. I mean, the CJNG has like militarized units with uniforms and trucks and, you know, machine guns and everything. These things are financed downstream through a parallel architecture that is completely outside of the traditional scope of financial governance worldwide. And so that's just one example. We know that the Houthis have accessed the Chinese language platform Huawei in Cambodia to launder like $40 million in funds. Uh, the reality is that militant and terrorist groups around the world are and can increasingly tap into this uh, unaccountable parallel layer of financial flows in a way that can produce real downstream consequences for global security.
Interesting. And just to basically move ahead into the kind of a depths of the illicit finance. So, how do illicit financial networks actually enable terrorism, sanctions evasion, and gray zone state competition in today's geopolitical environment? I'm asking this question because I think we are currently living in this day and age where all these things are happening simultaneously back to back.
Yeah. And they are different phenomena in a way. So, like, if we look at, oh, for sanctions evasion, we can look at Iran or we can look at China, but it's a similar thing where, you know, state assets have been allocated in a way that are moved off the books through shell companies, um, and opaque banking systems and stuff like this, uh, in a way that allow them to export and procure goods that they wouldn't otherwise be allowed to do because of sanctions. So the Iranians use it to sell oil and procure dual use technologies. The Chinese are using it to procure dual use military technologies like advanced AI chips, things like this. That's one way that illicit finance can be harnessed to do this. But once those systems are outside of formal governance, then they become an entirely new thing in and of themselves, and they're not fully accountable to the state. So with the Iranians, we know that the IRGC Quds Force controls the vast majority of these external sanctions evasions channels. And they do, in a sense, serve the state. They procure the items needed for missile guidance systems. They allow for oil exports, but there's a lot of people skimming off the top. And so we see a lot of money moving out of the country. I mean, China, we see record capital outflows in the past 5 years. Iran has had so many capital outflows that they've hollowed out the state, and the real is at a point of collapse. The currency is at a point of collapse. Um, so we already see these as a dual use vector that ultimately harms the states that enable them. And then there's the second and third order problems like the financing of terrorism. So we know that the Quds Force in Iran is financing um, Taliban operations, that they have ties to Al Qaeda. There are second order ties to, say, Al Shabaab in Somalia through the Houthis. And that may or may not be central to what Iran wants, but they're doing it anyway, right? And if something were to happen, like if, say, Al Shabaab were to launch a major attack on an American vessel or something of that nature, then what we could find is that this would produce blowback for the Iranian state that was completely unintended. Um, Similarly, once this money gets into the hands of terrorist groups, I mean, if Iranian oil sales to China through Houthi networks are used to finance Houthi operations, then inadvertently target a Chinese ship off the Gulf of Aden. I mean, that's not really good for China at all. But it's, again, it's beyond the scope of what's there in terms of governance for the state. It's an erosion of uh, financial discipline that produces, I think, the greatest downstream threat.
Yes, I think that's a really good insight. I mean, this question you can basically try to skip it also in case you feel it's confidential also. But I had heard this long back. I think even before I think the U.S. Venezuela standoff actually was happening. Uh, that the Venezuelan oil was making into its way into the black market. So
Yeah,
does how does the financial aspect work? Because I think even India was basically buying the Russian oil, and the same basically products were sold out to the Europe as well. So how
yeah.
does this basically whole system in general work out, and how do you in general track this kind of illegal finances that move this kind of, I think, either weapons or resources or maybe energy related material like crude oil?
So the global shadow anchor economy, um, as it's kind of emerged, is a very good example of how this um, unregulated financial mobility in a parallel system can operate. Right now, you've got about 1,000 tankers worldwide that the payments for these shipments are primarily done, through this parallel financial system. So it's hard to, you know, you can't disrupt it like a Swift transaction in the global banking system, right? The Venezuelans were accessing it to sell to China. The Iranians were accessing it too, and the Russians were accessing it. And this is where it becomes interesting because, in the formal oil market, different actors can reduce production, increase production to take advantage of markets. But in the informal economy, they're selling at a discount and they're selling from a place of desperation because they're already excluded from the financial system. And so after the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw a huge glut in international oil shipments from Russia in this discounted market, and an explosion in shadow tankers. So right from the outset, the original beneficiaries of that system, namely Russia or Iran and Venezuela, were already forced to sell at a cheaper rate because the Russians were flooding the market. That's one problem, and it got to the point where the Chinese actually had to hold off on buying Iranian oil, partly because there was a glut of oil inside China because of all this illicit oil that was entering the system through what are called teapot privately owned refineries in Shandong. But then, eh, because of their fear of sanctions exposure, they actually had to hold back on buying Iranian oil for quite a while. Now they're reconsidering it because of the Venezuela situation. So all of a sudden, this is kind of like a losing system, a race to the bottom. And now with the seizure of these tankers off the coast of Venezuela, we're seeing the system unravel. Because, and it's not just off the coast of Venezuela, there was one a few weeks ago that was seized in the Atlantic. Um, when you're the operator of a shadow tanker, you can't uh, insure your ship through Lloyd's of London, right? You have to have some kind of insurance to operate a vessel internationally. So you go through an off the books cheap solution, whether through a Russian state owned company or some kind of Chinese shell corporation. And when these things start getting seized, all of a sudden the risk escalates and the payouts don't come, because this is just a paper, an on paper type of insurance. It's not real. So the premiums get paid, but there's really you're operating at your own risk. So the seizure of these tankers is a good example of um, how brittle these state enabled systems really are when it comes to sanctions evasion, right?
Yes.
Because all of a sudden, it's not just like a few tankers get seized. Every single operator of a shadow tanker worldwide right now has already been contending with reduced profits because of declining prices due to increased competition in the illicit market. And now they're dealing with vessel seizures. So I think it's too early to predict, but it's very possible we could see a collapse of this shadow tanker fleet within the next 12 to 18 months as a result of these actions if they continue. Um, so, from a sanctions evasion state enabled perspective, these systems are incredibly brittle. But what's not brittle are the parallel financial systems that move value off the books. That's where resilience lays, and that's where network disruption really has to focus, I think. I mean, I'm not saying that busting sanctions evasion isn't important, but I think
Yes.
it's there's a greater chance of efficacy there. But
Yes.
the real shadow networks are the ones that are the alternate payments platforms. They're the ones that are much more resilient, and they're the ones that can finance all sorts of things. I mean, you know, when people look at Europe as a drug market, um, a big part of the reason Europe is such a big cocaine market is because of um, cartels moving product through the Sahel. They drop it in West African ports, and then they truck it up through the Sahel. Well, that has enabled all sorts of militant terrorist groups in the region, most notably in Mali, to get incredibly rich. And now, because they're so flush with cash, they can purchase the weapons they need to wreak havoc on the region. So JNIM is a very good example. And I mean, where are they getting their weapons? Well, the region's just become awash with Chinese weapons, so we're increasingly seeing them purchase Chinese weapons. Certainly not from the Chinese suppliers themselves, but they're getting to them nonetheless. So again,
Yes.
these parallel systems are where the real threat manifests in terms of resilient uh, global destabilization.
Yes. And just moving further into this, I mean that's a great level of detailed information that I think you took a deep dive into. Now I'm coming to the part which is I think the talk of this day and age, that is AI. So where does AI, that is artificial intelligence, for a broader set of audience that I'm mentioning this full form, where does artificial intelligence or AI genuinely change the game in detecting illicit finance, network mapping, as well as the pattern recognition or anomaly detection? And where is the hype overstated from your perspective and your experience?
Mhm. So when we are looking at these illicit financial flows, cryptocurrency plays a powerful and growing role because of its ability to move capital very, very quickly, even faster than systems like Hawala. At Hawala, you get into systems like if you're trying to move a very large amount of money, um, it becomes very difficult because you've got to have that money mirrored on the other end, right? So unless you're in a highly liquid place like China, that becomes much more difficult. So and even with Hawala, we're seeing crypto used to um, make people whole on the other end. So crypto is very, very important. And every single time, whether it's one of these privacy coins like Monero or a stable coin, like Tether, every single time a crypto transaction is made, a uh, it makes an entry into a ledger that is visible worldwide. Um, the problem is that there's so many billions of dollars moving through through these systems and recorded on ledgers that the amount of people it would take to analyze all of them and aggregate them and make sense of them is becoming increasingly difficult. It's a level of informational complexity that AI excels at. So things like pattern recognition, clustering, we're already seeing like blockchain analytics firms employ AI for these purposes. Now, humans are essential in making judgments because they, number one, can access contextual information that the AI may not think to look toward, right? So if you're seeing, flows from one country to another, an informed human analyst can say, well, we know that this group is operating here. We can check into that. And this group's on the other end. Maybe there's some ties there, right? Um, it also is allowed to perform judgments, that sort of thing. So it's going to take a cadre of trained analysts to really make sense of this. But in terms of the pattern recognition, the clustering, and that sort of thing, AI has enormous potential as a force multiplier in this regard, and I think um, it will become increasingly important as we start to wrestle with the scope of this problem.
Yes. And
On on
yeah, yeah, proceed,
I
go
I
ahead.
just want to say, yeah. Also on the other end, I mean, from a criminal finance perspective, I mean, AI has a multitude of applications as well. Uh, when we're looking at like scam center proliferation, we're already seeing scam centers proliferate outward into Africa and Latin America. Uh, these are linguistically more adjacent to Western markets. And as AI improves and the cadence and believability of AI systems improves, the real threat of AI based scamming increases, and we're already seeing it. We just had a congressional report in the U.S. about elder abuse in the scam economy, specifically using AI popping up. So AI is very much you know able to help in the combating of illicit flows, but it also can enable illicit actors, and especially when you see, large language models like DeepSeek, which don't have the guardrails that Western systems have, um, potentially being used and harnessed in this way, it becomes quite alarming as well.
Interesting. And what are the most dangerous blind spots in current financial monitoring system that illicit actors continue to exploit despite advances in AI? I mean, I know you briefly just mentioned about those kind of things, but yeah, please feel free to extend upon this.
I think that the current system is a product of stability in a lot of ways. Since the 1970s, the global market has become increasingly integrated and regulated. And I think it was very much blindsided by the emergence of decentralized finance as a parallel system. And so um, a lot of what we see now is kind of reactive. Um, and so now it takes proactive
Yeah.
network mapping to go out and map these parallel systems that are happening outside of the traditional scope of uh, of compliance teams. Um, I think these blind spots are getting narrowed. I think industries like blockchain analytics are certainly working toward this end, although even on that end, there's a real drive to kind of, let's find the wallets, let's disrupt these bad actors. And we're still falling short of full network disruption, and they'll tell you that themselves. You know it's great when you see a multi-billion-dollar bust in a system, but again, these systems have a way of just popping up over and over again. um, we are starting to get insight into how these systems operate, like with the Prince Group in Cambodia. That was a $15 billion disruption. There's some debate over the size of it, but um, when you see an amount of money that great stuck in a laundering node, that tells you there's gluts. That tells you that there are bottlenecks in the system that are moving money faster than launderers can launder it. And so that gives us some insight into the nature of these networks, but there's a lot of research that still needs to be done into figuring out the systemic logic of these systems.
Yes. I think these were great insights. I believe this concludes the first part of the two-part episode that we are planning. Uh, so I believe I would like to tell the audience that please listen to this first part of the episode, because the second part of the conversation is going to be much more interesting, and it's going to be deep dive on the AI side as well as on the other aspects of these issues. So we'll be back after a short break.